It's Dr. Gianna Reams, back to talk with you about our lost sources on Alexander. Before I get into specific names and such, I decided to make another little short video in the interest of not having any of these too long, with just some introductory information about sources. And when we say a lost source, what do we mean? Okay. It's lost not because of a conspiracy necessarily or somebody trying to suppress it. In most cases, in the wide variety of cases, it's lost because it got lost. At some point, it was destroyed and there was no translation of it. Are there maybe hidden copies of it out there somewhere? Maybe. But maybe not. Remember, all of the stuff this is written on is highly combustible, and people are walking around with little lamps that are oil and fire, and so having things burn is not an uncommon issue, unfortunately. Like the Library of Alexandria burned. So oftentimes they are lost by chance. Okay. So what comes down to us is one part luck, one part popularity. The more popular something is, the more likely there are to be multiple copies of it around. And again, another part luck. So there's a lot of luck involved with what we have. And we maybe have a fifth to a quarter of what was actually written in the Greco-Roman world. This becomes even more problematic with Persian sources and others, and I will say a little something about some of the Persian sources, though mostly I focus on the Greco-Roman because that happens to be what I know. Another popular thing, only Hollywood historians know multiple languages. Okay, most of us, it takes a long time to learn these languages. And we're expected to know Greek and Latin. That does not include reading cuneiform and Akkadian. There are a couple who can. My colleague Jennifer Fenn can, but most of us cannot. So we're somewhat limited in what we can read. And this causes issues of a different sort. But I did want to start with that. So when we're talking about the lost sources, that means things that simply didn't survive. So that's what we mean. How do we know about them then if they didn't survive? Well, they are mentioned in other sources. Okay. Does that mean there might be sources out there that existed that we don't know about because nobody mentioned them? Well, yeah, of course. I mean, our source Curtius is not, we don't even know who that is, and it's really chance that it survived. So there may be other things that were written that we simply don't know. But especially the more popular ones are mentioned in other sources where they got their information from. We talk about these in two ways. Testimonia is a mention of an author, okay, that they tell you something about them, where they're from, maybe when they were born, that sort of information, possibly what they wrote. Okay. Then we have fragmenta. And fragmenta is the text that is telling you what this person said. And I'm going to give you an example of one in just a minute. But I do want to point out these are very, very rarely exact quotes. Okay. So today, if you are quoting somebody, you may say it's closer to a citation of where I got information than it is to a quotation of what they said. Okay. So if you are familiar with citations, we are expected to cite, how do you know that? Where did you get that from? Okay. The ancients do that sometimes. Some are better at it than others. I mentioned in the video about other sources on Alexander, existing ones, that Athanasius in his supper party often tells us who the source is. I mean, he's showing off. Other sources may not do that, or may do that only sometimes when they remember to do it, or they think it's important. So-and-so said this, and so-and-so said that, and they contradict each other. So that's a little bit about how we recognize them. Now, the fragments and testimony of these Greek historians were gathered together at the beginning of the 20th century by a fellow named Jacoby. Okay, he's a German scholar, in a multi-volume work called The Greek Historical Fragments. That was redone, helmed by Ian Worthington for Brill, called Brill's New Jacoby. They enlarged on it a fair bit. And so the fragments are numbered. So you have fragment or F1, F2, F3, testimonia the same. In Brill's New Jacoby, which you'll see abbreviated BNJ, they're the same number. So you could go back to the original Jacoby, and this fragment is that fragment. There are some new ones, and they're added in as well. We're now in our second edition, or working through the second edition. My colleagues who put in the work on this should be given medals. It is spectacular, incredibly useful, and important for the rest of us trying to do this work. We now have translations in English, even by people who are not English speakers. These scholars come from all over the world that have been assembled to do this. So I'm going to share with you an example of this. And again, this is low tech here. So you're here for the information. You're not here for my fancy techno skills. So this is a photocopy from Brill's New Jacoby of Kleitarchus, and I picked him on purpose. Louisa Prandi did this. He picks people who know what they're talking about, so Louise is a specialist on Kleitarchus, and she's a specialist on a lot of things, but that's kind of how these people get chosen. It opens with a biographical essay, which tells you who he is, what he wrote, the histories of or on Alexander, usually abbreviated on Alexander, tells you roughly when he lived and was working in we think, the early Hellenistic era, maybe slightly later, but so some information about who is Kleitarchus. What do we know about this guy, if anything? Some of which comes from testimonia. And then you break it down into the actual material. So I'm just going to show you one. This is fragment 7. It appears, and she says where it appears, in Clement of Alexandria Miscellanies. And then there's an addition and stuff here. So first is a translation from this event, the return of the Heraclids, to Euenodos's archonship, and then there's a date because we know when that is. It's 335, 334 BCE, during which it is said that Alexander passed through Asia. Athenaeus claims that 715 years had passed, so between the Heraclids and Alexander. Instead, Ephorus, and then you get the BNJ number of this, is BNJ 70, fragment 223, writes that it was 735 years, while Timaeus and Kleitarchus mention 820, and Eratosthenes, I can never say his name right, which again, BNJ 241, fragment 1, 770, Durus, fragment or BNJ 76, fragment 4, 41. Instead asserts that 1,000 years had passed from the capture of Troy to Alexander's journey in Asia. And then you get the Greek text, okay? And after that, okay, you get the commentary by Prandi talking about this. So what is known about this? And at the very end of the entries, you get bibliographies. I'm just going to show you the end of that. Okay, so it gives you an idea of how BNJ works. These are embedded mentions in still existing sources. So that's what a fragment is. That's how we know who these people are. And the other thing you can note from this is these are not quoting. Okay, Clement is not coming out and saying Kleitarchus says, and then quoting Kleitarchus. He gives you the number. I got this information from these guys, and I picked that one because there's a whole list of various sources in there, so you can see how ancient sources tend to reference prior sources. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to how we know about these sources, where they're gathered, what a fragment is, what a testimony or testimonia is, and then the actual edited text. Now, when we're looking at those texts that you just saw, that is a very much cleaned up version from what would have appeared in the original papyrus. So these Greek texts are often, okay, broken at the edges, and again in the way of This is not fancy, but I have this on my phone, so you can see one. This is what we're dealing with, guys. Okay, that's a hole. That hole, we don't know what's missing in that hole. Maybe in some cases we might be able to guess, but if it's specific information like a name or a date or details, it's gone. It's just gone. And these are fragile, okay, and they break at edges and at corners and such. Also at the beginning, okay, so we roll them up. Okay, that's how scrolls work. By the way, as you can tell here, scrolls are not written down. So when you see bad Hollywood movies and they're unrolling them like that or reading, no. Okay. Maybe a letter is like that, but no, not the whole scroll. The scroll, you unroll it and you roll it back, and wherever you roll it back is wherever you stop reading. So that's our bookmark. So that's kind of what these things look like in reality. Another thing, I don't know if you can tell from this. Okay, it's all the same size. Okay. The invention of lowercase is Byzantine. Okay. And some of these are later texts, but papyrus survives in drier environments. They're not necessarily capitalized. There's not punctuation like we're looking at. And when we look at inscriptions, sometimes all the words are run together. So when ancients are reading, they're reading out loud. So they can sound it out and they figure out where the word ends. Later, they introduce this little dot in between words called an interpunct. But that's not necessarily there in text. There's not always spaces between words. So dealing with manuscripts means figuring out not just, and this is called textual criticism, by the way. It's not what's in the text. It's not the content. It's the actual text. What does the text say? You can't translate it until you have a text and you know what the text says. So that's a whole level of interpretation that a lot of folks don't even know that we're dealing with. So again, I wanted to show you these sorts of little details that sometimes get left out in this. So again, it's the texts here are much edited and have all the nice uppercase and lowercase and separations between words and such, so that it makes it easier. Most historians like me are not dealing with that. That's dealt with by textual critics who specialize in papyrologists, which is what they do. They sit in little, rooms with no wind and no fans, trying to piece this stuff together like a jigsaw puzzle, which means you really got to know your languages. So again, a little bit about how we get the texts that come down to us. One last thing I am going to hop on here just to explain is spelling. Okay, you will see me when I write up about the videos, what's in them. When I talk about authors like Kleitarchus, I will spell it for you in the descriptions rather than trying to put it on the stuff that's confusing. So I will spell it. When I'm dealing with still existing sources, things that you can go look up, you can go to the library, find the Loeb, look for it in its edition. I will use the publishing spelling, which is going to be Latin, okay, or Latinized. So we have Latin spellings and we have Greek spellings, and there are some distinct differences between them. Whenever I'm talking about a Latin author, obviously I use Latin, but when it comes to the Greek authors like Diodorus or Arian, I may use some common. I'm going to use common spellings. Okay, his name's Arianus. Okay. When it comes to the lost authors like Kleitarchus, like Callisthenes, etc., I will typically default to Greek. And in fact, I will default to Greek for most Greek names, with a few exceptions of very popular or well-known figures. So I'm going to call him Alexander. That is not his name. Okay, so surprise, for those of you who didn't know it, his name is Alexandros, okay, in Greek. And it got Latinized. But if I start talking about Alexandros outside of my novels, most people don't know who I mean. Okay, his father is Bilippos, not Philip. Okay, there are some others that are common, Antipater instead of Antipatros. For Alexander and Philip, I'm going to default to the Latin. For Antipatros, I'm going to use Antipatros. It's uncommon. Most people are not familiar with Antipatros. So it's got to be fairly common. Plato, Aristotle, I'm going to use familiar names, Ptolemy, instead of Ptolemaeus. So just if you see it, that you know when there is a C that is a Latin spelling. Okay? Latin doesn't have a K in it. The C is a K. Only later, as it became Anglicized, do we sometimes have that C working as an S sound. Okay? Just to confuse things more. Okay? So Alcibiades is Alcibiades. Okay? That C in the Latin is really a K. Okay? But we pronounce it now like an S. Okay? Socrates, you'll see me spell with a K. There's a few other things. The US, like in Diodorus, is actually an OS in Greek. Unless it's EUS, like Perseus. Then that's what it is in the Greek as well. So EUS is EUS. US is OS. Okay. AE is usually an AI, like Hephaestion. Okay. In the Latin, he's Hephaestion. Okay. The modern pronunciation, Hephaestion. Why do I say it weird, Hephaestion? Because that's where the accent was. And I'm trying to be respectful to the guy. If you walked up to him and called him Hephaestion or Hephaestion, he'd look at you like, who? Who are you talking to? Like if your buddy Jennifer, you walk up and call her Jennifer. Okay, she's going to go, what's wrong with you? Okay, so sometimes the accents also shift. Dionysus, not Dionysus. Dionysus is the Greek. I will usually default to more common spellings. So I wanted just to give you a little heads up on why I spell things weird sometimes, and in the case of Hephaestion, why I say it strangely, and a heads up on some of the more common spelling changes. There are a couple of others as well. I won't go into them, but you'll see them there, and so you'll know why I'm doing that the way I'm doing it.